Good evening, everyone. Delighted to see so many of you here for what is bound to be a very special evening. An evening with Paul Rogers is always special. Paul, I'm not going to talk about his distinguished biography. You've seen that on the screen behind me, and you've seen it for several months. But he's a very special person as far as Keele World Affairs is concerned. He first spoke at Keele World Affairs in, we think, 1985, so it's probably his 40th anniversary with us. We have detailed records that start in 1995, so I don't know what he talked about before then, but we certainly know about the many topics he has covered during that time, on each occasion with great distinction. And for that reason, we're always enthusiastic to invite him back. I don't normally talk the detail in front of the speaker, but give you an idea. He last spoke in October 2022. I think it was in connection with Mr. Putin at that time. And we do the member surveys, as you know, and we get a very big response to that. On that occasion, 200 people, because it was still a bit COVID-y, so the numbers were down, but 200 people replied to the member survey. And you know that question, shall we invite the speaker back again? 199 said, please invite Paul Rogers again. This is a total record. We don't know I haven't looked to see who the odd one out was. Might be here tonight. You are forgiven. And we have invited Paul yet again for one of his remarkable talks with us. He will be signing his book, The Insecurity Trap, which chimes quite closely with the topic tonight, the world in 2030. So I do hope you'll, I don't think this is going to be Paul's last visit, but I do hope that you will make your way to meet him at the book desk at the interval. And it's very special for me in what I declare as my last season of organising a season of World Affairs, and I hope that my successors will be including Paul in the years ahead. Without more ado, please welcome Professor Paul Rogers.
Thanks much indeed, Bill, for inviting me here, and for all of you actually wanting to hear me again, for heaven's sake. I don't know why. But it's really a delight to be here. As Bill said, it goes back a long way. I must look out my appointments diaries for that period. I can probably find out the first record. I seem to remember that I was a member of the staff for Peace Studies at that time, and I think a request came through, would have been from Owen Powell, about whether we had anybody who could talk about nuclear issues. And I drew the short straw and came and did a talk on it. I think there were about 40, maybe 50 people in the group. It was already developing then. And coming back more or less every second year for most of that time, it's been marvelous to see the way it's grown. It really is quite remarkable. Not only that, I mean, owing the idea of actually starting it, the way in which the university accepts it, and the universities often are really quite careful about how they have outside people involved. But of course, you've done the university proud in developing it this way. And I hope they realize just how important it is in terms of the overall standing of a university like this in the wider group, in the wider district, in fact. So it's really good to see it happen. I think particularly the last 15 or 20 years, it has just grown and grown. And it survived COVID very well. And now we're sort of back to the level of audiences we've got before COVID, and some. So it's a really delight to be here, and thank you very much for having me back. I don't know why I actually picked the title of The World in 2030, because it's a dodgy title to pick. What do you put in it? What do you mean? Can you say anything which will be in any way sensible? And will people expect you to predict accurately, and then in 2031 be emailing and say, you got it wrong on this, you got it wrong on that? Well, I'm sure I will. And I think all one can say is that it's an effort just to help us all look ahead and see what the major things are. Now, as you know, academics have two problems. They can't stop talking, but I'll be careful about this, and Bill will make absolutely sure. I was told before, 40 minutes, 41 and a half maybe, but not 42. So that's fair enough. And I have my watch here to back on with the digital clock at the back. Also, academics don't tend to fade away. They just lose their faculties, as they say in the trade. I haven't quite done that, but in any way, it's lovely to be back. How to approach this? I suppose if one is looking very broadly, I mean, the range of talks you've got this year are quite remarkable. And so many of them chime with little bits of the wider picture. You've got Jonathan Porritt at the end, you've had Karen Lucas, you've had people from, well, Jew, I think it's Richard, the tax guy, Richard Murphy is coming later on, real tax expert. You've got the head of the New Economics Foundation. It was a brilliant choice to be appointed, a remarkable person. I think he's coming here next week. And it will dovetail a little bit, but I'm only talking at a very broad area, which makes it easier to say I got that wrong because you're trying to cover such a big field. But I think there's a reason for trying to do this. And obviously, if you're looking at a world scale, all that's happening, and we are in very strange and in some ways pretty dangerous times, if you look at the whole area, do you simplify? Well, I think obviously there are major issues ahead of us. There are issues like, well, the possibility of a nuclear disaster. That's probably higher than it was a few years ago. I got rung up last night from somebody on Irish radio, and of course the Irish are very much geared to international affairs. And he said, can you come and do a quick talk on the breakfast program tomorrow morning about what Putin is about going back to testing nuclear weapons? Probably that's the first time in years that I had a media request to talk about nuclear issues. It used to be on the field many years ago, but we're back in that area. There are obviously concerns about pandemics. We've all been through that in a sense. There's a whole question of artificial intelligence, AI, and what that means. And of course, always there are the less sort of recognized ones, like the growth of nano-weaponry, super miniature weapons. And so there are all those happening. But I would argue, and this is what the book tries to do, is there are three overall trends which had to be watched, both in their sense of where they are themselves, but also how they interact. And they are essentially, I would say, environment, economics, and security. Those three broad areas. Over 50 years ago, a very bright, practically minded academic by the name of Edwin Brooks. He was a senior lecturer in, I think it was economic geography at Liverpool University. I went to a talk which he gave about trying to look at the future. And he said, he gave me one quote, he gave us all one quote, which I've never forgotten. And he said, he was talking about what could go wrong, what the sort of dystopic work we could have. And he said, the great tragedy would be that we would end up in a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate men in the global ghettos of the underprivileged. And when you think about it, it says so much, and the choice of words is interesting. Obviously, he said desperate men. I think we're a little bit more gendered aware nowadays, but that would have been fairly typical of over 50 years ago. But the final word he used was underprivileged. We don't use the term privilege very much in that context. For my mind, it's exactly the right word to use, because it implies there's a structural problem as well as anything else, which I believe there is. But when you put it all together, that, in a sense, is what we had to avoid. And to be fair to Brooks, he then explained how he might do it. And he was also interested, but in his talk did not have time to look in much detail about how we had got there so far and how there was this bad prospect. So what I want to try to do is bear that in mind and then look at those three. I'll go through them each turn, looking, if you like, at the downside and whether there are upsides. Say a little bit about how they interconnect, and then try and sketch ways of looking forward and maybe how we can contribute ourselves. So let's take environment first. This is a massive subject in its own right, so I'll just simplify it a little bit. I would point, I think, to two books written in 1961 and 1971 by two American scientists, both women. And I'm sure you will recognize at least one of the names, and that, of course, was Rachel Carson, who was the author of Silent Spring. Carson was a very gifted writer. She'd written some brilliant books about the oceans. She was a freshwater biologist, incidentally, worked for the US Department of Agriculture. And she wrote a book called The Sea Around Us, and then another one called The Edge of the Sea. And they were bestsellers, million sellers. She had this marvelous style of writing. She then got interested in the problem developing then in the 50s and early 60s of pesticides and what they were doing to wildlife, hence Silent Spring. And that book really took off like wildfire. I'm afraid it was very much criticized by the agrochemical industry, and she took a huge amount of flack for writing it. But because she was such an accurate scientist and got a lot of support from other scientists, essentially the message got through that actually we were having impact on the global environment, and we had to realize this and change our ways. That really brought in, it was one of the things that pushed us into the era of thinking about environmental issues. So by the end of the 60s, it was much more clearly there, and we'd seen the big incidents. I mean, we'd seen the terrible Aberfan disaster, the wrecking of the Torrey Canyon on the Seven Sisters Reef in the Channel Islands, and many other examples, and things were happening. And the UN had the huge first environmental conference in 1972. 1971 had come the other book, less well known, and that essentially, I'll just get the title so I've got it absolutely right. That one was, hold a sec, we'll get there in a minute. Yes, that was actually the one called simply Limits to Growth. And it was written by 4 systems analysts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The key driver was actually Donella Meadows, another not well-known woman scientist at that time, but of course she left an incredible legacy. And it was really saying we are outgrowing the capacity of the world system to cater with increasing activity of human beings and how they affect the environment. And essentially it predicted in the distant future that we could get a situation where systems were actually really breaking down. Now, if that's the case, then of course that was a huge thing to be concerned about. Again, the time at that period, people really did not believe it. And people said, no, this is just doomwatch stuff. And in fact, people didn't really realize that Limits to Growth was looking 50 or so years ahead. It's predicting where the problems would develop in the 2020s and 2030s. And in fact, work which was done more recently takes that model and applies it, and it was uncannily accurate. And essentially, that was another thing which made people realize we really are coming to the end of a particular period. And there was a very strong argument that we had to rethink what we even mean by economic growth. Limits to Growth did not go down well with most mainstream economists, but it turned out to have a very big impact on the way people really began to think. And I think if you look at that period through to the end of the 1970s, you're beginning to see an understanding of what we were about. And essentially, what was recognized was there had to be some way of organizing society and organizing our use of resources and the pollution we produced in a different way. And if not, we were going to have very major problems. And even then, back in the 1970s, you actually had an interest in this phenomenon of people beginning to talk about, very occasionally, they use the term climate stability or climate change. Before I moved to Bradford, where I came to work about 40 or so years ago on environmental conflict, I'd actually taught environmental science, and I came across one of my early set of lecture notes back at Huddersfield Polytechnic back in 1972. And it was on biogeochemical cycles, things like the nitrogen cycle, but this is on the carbon cycle. And right at the end of the lectures, there's just a little sentence saying, there is some suspicion that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to have an effect on climate. Now, this was an ordinary young lecturer in a polytechnic, and it had got through to somebody like that. So even then, the knowledge was there. We knew that something big was happening, and of course the specialists knew it far more and were already trying to sound the alarm. Now we're much closer to the major problems, and where we've been over the last, I would say probably 20 or 30 years, it's been a really mixed message. On the one hand, there's been a lot of progress in understanding. And one of the most important things is that we actually find that as you do better and better modeling, have bigger and bigger computers to make the predictions, the climate scientists are getting more and more confident that they got it right. And, you know, we're seeing COP30 actually starting, the pre-meetings tomorrow, and it actually starts on Monday. And there is a general acceptation that we're putting far too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it's already causing very major problems. You will have heard about the Jamaica, we call it hurricane, but I mean, it's also known as typhoons or other terms. That was a pretty bad one, where the peak wind, a gust, was, 185 miles an hour. But and there's been a terrible one actually in the Philippines just in the last 36 hours, almost as powerful. 5 or 6 years ago, one hit the Philippines where you had 160 miles an hour lasting 10 minutes. Not a gust, steady wind at 160 miles an hour. And in fact there, I think, best part of 7,000 people died in spite of all the warnings that were given in the availability of shelters. And there's one of the big predictions that was made for many years that severe weather events might get rather more frequent, but they will get more intense. You can more or less guarantee that. And we're actually seeing that now. Now, in one way, that's a very positive thing because it means people actually see it happening. And also, the quality of the work is very much higher than it was. People can speak with confidence. And ordinary people, particularly younger people, are really recognizing what is going on and getting very worried, and in some cases getting very angry about it. And so we're getting the beginnings of quite large-scale non-violent direct action, and people going to jail for what they consider to be their rightfully held beliefs and the dangers that we faced. Now, essentially, in spite of all of this, we're not on top of the problem at all. In fact, at the moment, we're probably going the wrong way, because there are several governments, and I won't just list Mr. Trump, there are others as well, that just will not buy into it. And we also find that many of the major fossil carbon companies, coal, oil, and gas, really want their own systems continue and do not want to actually decarbonize. But the specialists will say, and you've got a very good one speaking, I think, later in the year, that essentially we have to change, and we have to change quickly. Can that happen? Well, the other side of the coin on this is that there are astonishing changes which are much more positive. One of our sons, Tom, is a renewable energy engineer. He's worked in the tropics for many years. He's currently lecturing over at Nottingham Trent University. And so I get a lot of feedback from him. And he says, you know, in almost every part of the technological base, whether it's essentially wind power, solar power, batteries, integrated grids, and the rest, there are developments coming out almost every other month, and the changes are extraordinary. My wife was always keen that we get a photovoltaic array on the roof of one of our cottage, which faces the right way, and finally she got it done about, I think, 12 or 13 years ago, and it cost us a lot of money. At that time, the system cost £11,500, but the payback available from the government meant that you could probably repay it in less than 11 and a half years. So we did it, we put it in, we did eventually repay it, but the key thing about it is an £11,500 system at 2011 prices, 2012 prices, that would be the equivalent of about 16,000 now. A similar system now, with battery, would cost you 4,500. So the way it's come down in price is extraordinary. My son, Tom, points this out to me. We have another son who's a maritime engineer involved with navigation risk of new wind farms. And he says, you know, if you take an average-sized wind farm from sort of, say, the 1990s, and we have one near us in the Peak District, then you might have sort of a dozen turbines producing a total of maybe 9 or 10 megawatts. A single turbine will do that now, and even do 15 megawatts. So in other words, if you have a 10 by 10 array in the ocean where the wind is pretty steady, that is equivalent to a large nuclear power station. One particular wind farm, and you can probably build that in 2 or 3 years, and you can actually make them last for certainly 20, 30 years. The one that we have near us is now into its 28th year, and still most of the turbines are working. All I'm saying is there is hope in that area. But I'm conscious I'm going a little bit too detailed, so let me go a little bit faster. In a nutshell, climate breakdown is probably the biggest single issue that we face as a species at the present time. It's not the only one, we touched on some of the others, but it is probably the biggest. And essentially, it interacts with the other two, economy and essentially security. On the economic side, well, we have a sort of end problem of what some people call runaway wealth. We have an immense division developing in the world community in terms of who has the wealth and, to an extent, who has the power. I think we don't really realize just how extensive it is. I won't give you loads of statistics, but broadly speaking, probably about 0.1% of the world's population is doing incredibly well. And some of the individuals, it's quite unbelievable. I mean, we know all about Elon Musk. Probably he vies with one other person to be the world's richest person. But to give you an example, at the American election last year, he fed, what was it, $250 million into campaigning for the person he favored most, who was Donald Trump. $250 million is 1,000th of his wealth. That gives you some sense of perspective. Now, people aren't lots of people at that level, but lots of people are worth billions. Nearly 3,000 billionaires in the world. And that gives you immense power, which actually I think many people are now starting to think is a bit of a threat to democracy. Be that as it may, by and large, people who have that kind of wealth come from a background in which climate change doesn't really figure. And this, I think, is a fundamental problem we have. But why is this? Here again, I think you have to go a little bit back very quickly. And what we have in the 1970s and particularly 1980s was a change in the world economic model. Leave to one side the communist bloc, including China, but looking at the Western side, you had Keynesian economics, which always had a degree of welfare built into it, basically to ensure a degree of stability, as the advocates would have it. And essentially the neoliberal system, which was developed from the Chicago School back in the Second World War period and developed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, had a very different approach to what you might call the way in which society was best organized from an economic standpoint. And essentially, it meant that you had to have something which was much more freer and more genuinely competitive. And this meant that, for a start, you would try and, I suppose you would put it as, deregulate economic and financial systems and don't have them people absolutely bogged down in red tape. Privatization was much more favorable than nationalization in that view, that this allowed people freedom to develop, and as people developed, more competition. It means there would be basically faster rates of development. It obviously meant that you wanted to limit the degree of unionization, to have labor relations at a very sort of controlled way, because otherwise individuals might sort of get in the way of what was really needed, which was free market competition. And of course you did need a tax system which benefited the more successful people. You put that all together, and that was what came in the time of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and the rest. And in a sense, it began to push to one side the whole idea of the Keynesian model. And in fact, there was what was known as the Washington Consensus, where bodies like the IMF and the World Bank would actually advocate this for the countries in the global south. You know, if you wanted to get a loan from IMF, fair enough, but the quid pro quo might be you needed to have a stronger element of privatization and not have the big parastatals, which were thought not to work. The end result of all of that was that you had this move, quite a transformation. It got a massive boost, of course, in 1998, 1999, with the collapse of the only rival system. That's the central planned system of the communist bloc, the Soviet bloc as well. China took a rather different route. It combined a pretty rigid political system with a degree of private enterprise under pretty strict control. And that, in fact, from their perspective, not everybody's by a long shot, from their perspective has actually been very successful. But as far as the rest of the world was concerned, with the sort of coming apart of the Soviet bloc, this seemed to be proof positive that, in fact, what you needed was this free market approach. What we've seen progressively over the last 25 years, it is not working. And in fact, it's turning out to be a rather dangerous model. And one of the problems with this is the kinds of divisions which are developing. and the way in which across much of the world now in different forms, we're getting populations who are uneasy about their own position. You see it particularly across the global south. Early in my career, I spent a couple of years working in East Africa and Uganda. And Uganda at that time had one university, Makerere, pretty good place in its own right. But that was the lot. There were no other universities. Not many kids even went through high school. Fast forward 40 or 50 years, and you find in Uganda you have three times the population you had, much better educated. And one of the issues is that they have a much clearer idea of where they stand in the world order of things, and are far more knowledgeable of the fact they do not get a very good deal. And essentially you'll see in many parts of the world now what I think people tend to call under sort of a perimeter, sort of a general name, revolts from the margins. And in different ways that is also happening in the global north. And that can mean mostly a move to the far right, but not always. It can go the other way as well. But what I'm talking about is what you'd like a degree of societal instability developing and developing pretty radically. And essentially some means has to be found to change the nature of the system. I'm delighted that you've got Richard Murphy coming. You've got the guy from the New Economics Foundation who's brilliant. And essentially, they will probably be presenting aspects of this. At least I hope they will. I'm sure they will in different ways. And we've got other areas. We've got the circular economy being developed. We've got the so-called donut economics, which I think is a lovely term. And of course, one has to remember that the whole world in the Western world, and particularly across the global south, doesn't work only through the idea of shareholder capitalism. There are about 950 million people worldwide who are members of cooperatives, far higher proportion in the global south than in the global north. And those basically have very different approaches. They're not profit-making in the old sense, but they're successful. And some of the ones in Europe, the Mondragon co-op in northern Spain has been spectacularly successful for many years. So what I'm saying, there are different ways of doing it, but we're going to have to learn how to do those relatively quickly and make the changes relatively quickly. And if we can do that, then again, it will be possible to make serious progress. But the problem here is we don't have very much time, because apart from anything else, we've got to have a world economy which is really fit for purpose and working well, certainly within 5 to 8 years, because of climate breakdown. We've got to have a system which can actually have sufficient planning to look ahead to actually go for rapid decarbonization. We know that can be done technically. It wasn't even clear 5 years ago that it could, but this is where the change potentially is really positive. But essentially, at the moment, it's very knife-edge stuff, which then, of course, brings me to the security, what we mean by security. I've been very lucky in my career in that on many occasions, most years over the last 40 years, I've been invited to do lectures at the senior defence colleges, Joint Service Commander Staff College, Royal College of Defence Studies. In fact, I've been an external examiner for masters and PhDs at both colleges. So I've been very lucky to be able to sort of engage with military people at a range of different levels. And essentially, by and large, military audiences are very knowledgeable in their own fields. They are also, to some extent, trained to look ahead in terms of the nature of things they may face. I had a personal experience of this probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I got an invitation out of the blue to go and do an opening session in a one-day seminar being run down at Wadham College in Oxford, organised by a group in Oxford, I think it was at Pembroke College, on the changing nature of warfare. It was to a government audience, and it was a one-day session on the risk of weak and failing states to British security. Weak and failing states across the world, how might they affect British security? It seemed a very interesting topic. They didn't actually say what the audience was. I assumed it may be on the diplomatic side. So I arrived there, had a very nice supper in the pub with the guy organising it the night before, and he said, look, we've got sort of 7 or 8 specialists in different parts of the world who are going to give short talks about how they see this problem. And my job, very simply, was to do a bit of an overarching thing, dead easy at the start, a little the sort of talk and sort of in summary that I'm doing tonight. And essentially, that was great. I could sort of do that, get over the nerves, and then listen to these experts. And I asked the guy, well, what actually is the audience? Oh, he says, that's interesting. It's the Commandant and all the senior officers of the SAS, with the SBS, Special Boat Service, and people from MI5, MI6, and Defence Intelligence. So you gulp and you swallow and you think, oh, that's going to be interesting. But the thing was that they took it very well, and I did label the importance of climate breakdown. And what was fascinating was the first person to speak after me was a very knowledgeable analyst from Islamic Relief, British woman, convert to Islam, and she really knew her stuff. And of course, Islamic Relief is actually a large aid organization, probably about nearly the size of Christian Aid, but it tends to operate quite a lot in Islamic countries, many of them which are semi-arid. And she actually departed from her speech to say she wanted to mention one thing. I'd raised the issue of climate change. She said their experience with a very experienced, knowledgeable NGO was that this is probably one of the biggest single topics that came in from their field staff every year. So in other words, there was already a much greater concern in the field at changes in harvest, the way in which you're getting the storms and the droughts. And that was a really good marker. But when you actually talked to the military people and say, well, what essentially are you going to be able to do about this? They don't see it as their remit for reasonable ends. I mean, if you're a professional soldier going up the ranks, looking ahead, then what you're about is keeping the nation safe. In other words, to use the jargon, defending the realm, because it is obviously a monarchy, despite Mr. Andrew, what's his name? And the sense about this is that if you're in the military, you look about the threats as they arise and how do you keep the country safe. It is not seen as your job to look ahead 15 or 20 years about what these unusual threats may be and what you do about it. That is the job for the politicians. And it's a perfectly understandable thing to take. And there are some exceptions. Admiral Morissetti, who retired about 7 or 8 years ago, senior admiral, and he now works in one of these institutes looking at the way the world is going. And he's held for a long time and was prepared to say it when he was in uniform, that climate change is the big issue. But they're fairly few and far between, because essentially in the security field, you're looking at the threats and how you respond to them. But also, it's the way the whole field is really, I suppose, organized even. And what one would go back to here was Dwight Eisenhower, President Dwight Eisenhower's last, what do they call it? His last address to the nation when he finished his second term in 1960 as President of the United States. Of course, Eisenhower had been the supreme Allied commander in the Western world at the end of the Second World War. You know, a military person right the way through. But he gave this final address concentrating on what he called the dangers of the military-industrial complex. That they got too big, too profitable, and could more or less control the whole narrative of what we really meant by security. People wouldn't have taken much notice except that he was so different. He'd actually been through it the whole time. And he just saw it differently. He saw power really developing in what you might call a sort of a military culture. And it was one which wasn't really fit for purpose and wasn't what we needed. There was a centre of power. And in a sense, I think this is aided by the way in which military-industrial complexes work. For starters, obviously you have different groups. You have the military, you have the civil servants, you have the arms industries, the many different companies involved, not so many as they were because there's been so many amalgamations. You have the think tanks, the intelligence services, the universities, who get a lot of money from government for this sort of work, far, far more than they give to peace studies, I should say, but then I'm biased on this. But also, you also find that there is a degree, inevitably, and again, understandably, of secrecy. You know, it's not something you discuss in polite circles, how things work. And because there's a huge amount of money to be made out of it, there are constant examples of the revolving door. I can remember going to one of the major defense colleges and speaking to the commandant and getting to know him well over a couple of visits. And then about 3 or 4 years later, he'd retired and he was in a senior position in an arms company. And of course, anybody from an arms company's point of view, if you can actually get somebody joining your group a couple of years after he or she is retired from weapons development or weapons manufacture, then it really helps you a lot. So it's a kind of closed system. And the end result of that is there isn't much independent work going on it, very little independent work. And I'm afraid the present government and its immediate predecessor on the nuclear side has made this worse. The Conservatives, toward the end of their period, and Labour certainly now, are even more secretive about what's happening with our nuclear weapons, how many we have, how they're being developed, and how they might be used. Because people tend to forget, Britain, like most nuclear powers, and there are, 9 of them, has a first-use policy. We do not have a no first-use policy. We are prepared to use nuclear weapons first in certain circumstances. Very few people even aware of that, but it's a major problem. So we end up now with a need to really rethink what we mean by security. Here again, there's some very good work going on this. Groups like Safer World and Rethinking Security. Google either of those, Safer World or Rethinking Security, because they are independent bodies, quite often with Quaker support, because the Quakers have been very diligent over the years in doing this. I should say, incidentally, they're the reason we even had a Peace Studies Department at Bradford, because they helped fund it at the start. But essentially, there is good work going on, and there's new thinking going on. But it's got to happen pretty quickly, and at the moment, things are going the other way, because in fact, not least because of the wars not so much in Sudan and the Congo, terrible though those are, but certainly in both Ukraine and Gaza, there have been huge bursts in arms spending. And in fact, Britain, we have this extraordinary situation of one government actually cutting the overseas aid program by $4 billion a year, and another government, a Labour government, shifting it and putting it into defence, which is one of the reasons, I'm afraid, there's a lot of angst within the Labour Party, if any of you are involved in it. The end result of all of this is that we're in something of a quandary. Bill, how am I doing? How many minutes have I got? Can you give me an idea? Am I nearly up to time? No. Can people stand another 5 minutes?
Absolutely.
All right, okay. We've got loads of time for questions, which is always the best part of the evening. It's a question of trying to put it all together. Just to summarize, we are in a very particular position. Now, it's very easy for somebody like me to come along and say, we've got a very tough period the next 5 years, and keep saying it every time. And I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that, on many occasions, one does tend to do this because there are considerable difficulties. I remember one person asked me, well, how do you feel personally? I said, well, look, I worked for the last 45 years or so, first on nuclear issues, and most commonly in the recent years on changing causes of conflict, and particularly problems of political violence and terrorism. I said, I've only got 3 choices. I'm either alcoholic, suicidal, or optimistic. And the thing is, there are reasons for optimism, which is why I've touched them, and there's a real possibility for optimism in what is the biggest immediate problem, not the only problem, the biggest immediate one, in my view, and I think the view of most people who work professionally in the field, is climate breakdown. It can be done. And the real issue is, will it be done in time? Now, if you look at the different ones, we have the problem on the security side, and that we tend to think about security in very much a state-centered way, how states behave and how states respond to threats. The alternative way is to look at it much more in a human way. The average person in the average household isn't spending the time day and night worrying precisely on what Putin is doing. They're much more worried about their own circumstances, their immediate security, their families and the rest, at a time of great difficulty. But we don't take that into account at all when we're talking about security, which is one of the reasons why we can spend, at least £210 billion over the next 30 years on maintaining a nuclear system. Personally, I have a big problem with that. I think, in fact, maintaining British nuclear weapons is part of a delusion of post-imperial grandeur. And there are much better ways to use the money. That's just a personal view. I should have said at the start, always I'm speaking personally. I'm not representing the university. But essentially that I think feel very strongly about. But the issue here is if you start to look at things in a different way, as well as climate, then you begin to make progress. So in those different areas, rethinking security, which is going to take a lot of trouble, rethinking the economy and how it works, and I think we're farther down to recognizing how important that is going to be because of the way in which power is changing, and most particularly responding to climate breakdown, which we know can be done, then essentially we have the prospect of coming through all this. And I think it is fair to say that in the next 5 years, which is why I picked the date of 2030, we will know really which is going to succeed in the short term. Let me end with not so much a prediction, but a possibility. What will actually happen? I suspect that there will begin to be more and more changes, the recognition about what we have to do, and I only sketched it out very briefly, I think will be coming more to the fore, in spite of the fact that many governments, not least those of a certain Donald Trump, do not see it this way. I think overall things will change. Whether they change quick enough is another matter. I think there will be a lot of progress against the odds on the climate side, because I think the reality is that so many of the new methods of generating electricity are markedly cheaper than the others. Resisted very heavily by the oil and gas companies, but they're actually cheaper. And that will win eventually. And that is happening at quite a pace. In fact, you look at the International Energy Agency, and the way in which it is changing its predictions almost every year and speeding up is actually really very good news. I think on the whole issue of the economy, that again is an area where it can work. And in other words, I suppose what I'm trying to say is we have the prospect of doing things better, but what would actually happen, I rather suspect, and this is in a sense a difficult way to look at it, that over the next 2 or 3 years we will get examples of seriously extreme weather events. In other words, we've had a heat dome which more or less took out a Canadian town. Most of the people had got out in time in a matter of minutes because the temperature got so high. If that was to happen over a major northern city, and you have thousands of people killed in a matter of hours when a heat dome formed, and that is not impossible by a long shot, then that might be the kind of thing which would really shake people up. And if you were going to get something like the hurricane which hit New Orleans a few years ago, but one which actually hit one of the bigger, farther northern cities and did far worse damage, again, that might be the shock. Now, that's a terrible thing to say, because what you're saying is you've got to have such a shock to people that it really doesn't make a difference. And it's worth remembering it's already happened. We tend to forget what happened in Derna in northern Libya just about 4 or 5 years ago, when an incredible downfall in the hills to the south, and this is sort of many miles to the south, many kilometers to the south, came down through a huge wadi, smashed 2 dams to smithereens, and went straight through the center of the city. Incredible thing, and about somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people died in a matter of minutes. It was not well reported overseas, but when you look at what had happened, if that had happened somewhere else, and we got fairly near it, Valencia, not so long ago, then that might be a sort of shock. Now, that's a terrible thing to say, and what it means essentially is the very important role that people have now, all of us in different ways, is to accept a rather unusual definition of prophecy. And that is, prophecy is suggesting the possible. But as well as saying, woe, and this is what could happen, you're also saying, this is what can happen if we come to our senses. And I think it's on a bit of a knife edge. I think there's every reason that we might actually make it. And the real issue is, how far do we have to have disasters before we really wake up to it? And the more people are aware of it, the more people are working to look at better ways forward, the less long we will have to wait. And this is why I think it's an extremely important thing for ourselves, whether you're students, whether you're in the teens, your 20s, 30s, or like me in your 80s, etc. This is the need that we have to do now. There is hope for the future. I really do believe this. I hope I'm around long enough to actually see it very clearly becoming, but the signs are there. So what I would end up with is the idea is there is a genuine reason for remaining optimistic, even when it looks pretty dodgy. But having said that, I hope at least what I've done is provided some food for some interesting questions and discussion later in the evening. Thanks so much indeed.
Paul, you started in the area of climate, and we've got a lot of questions about that. So if you wouldn't mind, let's look at some of the questions you've generated there. Right. There are quite a lot of questions that have come up about something that's immediate, which is COP30?
Yeah.
So several people, June Avison and Susan Dormer and Linda Mottram, all asking about COP30 and the fact that 3 major players, at least, are not going to be attending. And I think we got a I'll just add to that one, just because it add a little bit of variety to your answer. Graham essentially wonders whether COP30 needs a 4-lane highway driven through the Amazon so that for all its 50,000 visitors. Yes. So I don't know whether that has an impact on. But the main question is about the absence. And you might like to expand that, since you've been optimistic about climate, as to whether actually the COP series is actually part of the solution, or is it part of the problem?
It's a major issue because COP, incidentally, as you probably know, stands for Conference of Parties. There's a Conference of Parties to the original setup 30 years ago of actually getting some sort of system of bringing climate change under control. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's a question of heads of state. As far as I know, India and China have a pretty big presence, but not the head of state. And symbolically, that's very important. In the case of the United States, it's worse, in that there may be people present there who can say they speak for the government. Certainly, Trump wouldn't go anywhere near it. And he's made it clear they're not even going to keep to the agreement which was made in Paris many years ago, which people previously were adhering to in terms of getting at least a rough timetable for what we had to get to. And if you remember, that is trying to keep the level of increase in temperature below 1.5 degrees above what it was, I think it's about in the 1990s. I can't remember the exact figures. So essentially, we did have an agreement which wasn't necessarily being kept. The Americans under Trump have said, we don't even want to do that, we're not going to do that. India and China do not think it's worth sending their head of state, which indicates they do not think it's going to be a major breakthrough, but it doesn't mean they aren't interested. And it is worth saying that which country of all the countries in the world is doing the quickest to go basically non-carbon? It is actually China, which is doing it at a heck of a rate. I mean, last year, China installed more wind power than all the rest of the countries of the world put together. And it's been doing that for 2 or 3 years. They're still building some coal-fired power stations, usually to replace less efficient ones. They're investing hugely in production and cheap production, lower and lower cost in economies of scale of essentially of solar panels and wind turbines. You're seeing them going right across some parts of the country. Why? I think there are 2 separate reasons. One is, and they're quite right on this, China is going to be one country which suffers hugely if we don't change. It's going to be one of the early real sufferers of this, and they know that. The second is they can make money out of it. If they organize themselves with all the mass production and the rest, then they can make, say to use the term, a killing out of it. But the Chinese have recognized that this is a problem, and because of the nature of the state, a combination of a semi-free market and a pretty autocratic state, this is one of those rare occasions where one has to admit that autocracy in this particular case may actually be making some progress, even though we would much prefer a democratic system. So it's a complicated position. India also, but more recently, there have been very big changes in the Indian attitude over the last, I say, as little as 5 years. In the case of China, it's more like 20, 25 years. But in the case of India, also it recognizes that it's going to suffer hugely itself with massive loss of life if the world as a whole doesn't change. And this is why India, I think rather more reluctantly than the Chinese, are starting to make the change. That does, of course, leave us countries like Russia, which has no interest in this under Putin, particularly because of all the oil and gas they have. Coal and oil that they have, some gas as well. So where are we with the United States? Well, here again, it looks to be very bad news, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. I mean, obviously, Trump is running into some political problems. The results of the New York election and the one, was it, I think, Georgia and Virginia, over the last 24, 48 hours, show there's a change, and quite a serious change. But the more significant thing is that, I'll give you one example. Texas is very much a Republican state. In fact, the seats are being so gerrymandered that I think in next year's midterms, it'll be even more Republican. But one of the problems is that many Republican developers and industrialists are investing heavily in wind power, because wind power on the Texas plains is the cheapest way to generate electricity. And the end result is some of them are getting, I won't say, well, I would say pissed off, but no, rather annoyed that the legislature in Texas is actually prepared to go along with Trump and make it more difficult for them to make money out of wind power when it's the cheapest way to do it. So there are even tensions developing there. But what I understand, and I'm not sufficient of a specialist in this, other sort of people here will be, is that the way the state system works in the United States, there is a lot of independence in states, some of which it uses more than others. And a number of states are basically ignoring what Trump is doing and having legislation which requires people in their state to carry on with what they said before, like going for electric cars and the rest. So it's not as grim in some ways as you might expect. And I think the real problem that Trump will face, and if I may speak politically for the moment, is certainly going to be faced by Reform and Nigel Farage, is they're actually missing the boat. Because within another 5 years at the very most, it'll be so absolutely obvious that this is the way forward, as the systems become even cheaper, that they will look very silly in resisting it. That may be more a hope than a prediction, but I think it's pretty likely that is already changing. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see, like people like Nigel Farage, who's very skilled at the populism side, if he finds that actually this isn't working, he will drop it quickly. Somebody like Trump probably can't, which is in many ways, in human behavior terms, the more interesting one. So it's a bit of a rambling answer. It's a mixture here. But essentially, that, I think, is the explanation for the direct question.
Just to top that, round that off, Tony MacDonald quotes Trump as saying, the climate crisis is the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world. Yeah. So he wonders, in fact, whether that's encouraging people not to attend COP30. But do they? He wonders, does anyone believe Trump's quote? I mean, is that going to have any impact on the optimistic direction that is it going to be a braking force on what is going underway? Well,
2 points to that. One is, yes, there are many people who do believe, I use the word precisely, they do believe that climate change is a con. We need to face that. Plenty of people actually believe that. You say to them, well, I don't really think it's a matter of faith, is it? It's not a matter of faith, it's a matter of what we're actually seeing. But people finding it difficult to accept. We shouldn't underestimate the ability of people to sort of grasp a particular issue and have it pushed to them so often by so many people that they come to believe it as a matter of faith, even if the evidence suggests against it. And when I have to accept that, it's the same with many other things like vaccines and the rest. So there's a problem. But really, the answer to the question, I don't know, but I suspect the times are changing sufficiently now that the impact of people like Trump on that is going to diminish. I think it may be already diminishing. Maybe that is too optimistic, but I think it's already starting to change. And some of the recent developments, the way in which individual states are basically ignoring what he's saying, the way in which there's even a change in the nature of voting, maybe not on this issue, I think people are just seeing that this does not make sense. I mean, Nigel Farage says more or less the same thing. This is a con. And I think that is beginning to be a bit of a lost cause. As I say, I think Farage is more than sharp enough to realize that he may need to ditch it. I don't think Trump is.
Cynthia England was listening to you talking about catastrophic events. Yeah. And she seems to be wondering whether there's time, because time is limited, for one of these catastrophic events to have an impact where the major political decision makers are really affected. Perhaps she's wondering if a tornado might sort of go right through the White House in the next 4 years. Yeah. In your study of this, do you think it's going to impact any part of the world where people will sit up and take notice?
Well, again, you can look at history. I mean, I think it was 1854. You heard of the Great Stink? That was that occasion when London did not have a proper sewage system. So was it Joseph Bazalgette, who was the head of the engineering at the Northern Water Board, was promoting a really modern, state-of-the-art sewage system and couldn't get people to agree. And there's a lot of pressure to do something about it, made even more so because of the risk of cholera, and people knew that you had to have a decent system if you're going to avoid cholera. And what happened in the Great Stink was it was particularly nasty, very hot weather in the middle of the summer, and it stank so much that Parliament was directly affected. And in fact, I think they even gave up sitting in Parliament because the Thames was unbelievably smelly. You know, it made people completely ill. And that one event really made a difference. And Bazalgette got his system. And in fact, even now, the outfall system down to, what is it, Beckton in southern Essex, much of it originates from that period. Much closer to, I have to admit, my age, 1952 was the Great Smog of London. Now, I was a kid at school. I think I would have been 9 then. And essentially, if the answer is 82, but essentially, get the thinking caps on. I mean, certainly, I remember going to school then when, you know, you couldn't see more than about 5 yards in front of you. Heathrow was a small airport then. The last plane to land before they closed the airport got lost taxiing to the terminal. They had to send out trucks to find it. They closed the cinemas in London because you couldn't see beyond the 5th row of the seats. And it lasted, 4 days. At the time, they reckoned that something like 10,000 people died, mostly older people with respiratory conditions. When they looked at it again, it was far more than that. But that actually brought in the beginning of the Clean Air Acts by some years, because it was a shock. What we hope we don't have to have is something on such a bigger scale that it affects the politicians. And essentially, one hopes not, but it may have to be. But there have been things like that have happened before. We've been there before, and it has worked. I should have mentioned also the one thing we forget. There's already been one major example of a worldwide environmental issue which could have been utterly lethal to the whole world, except we learned to deal with it. And that, of course, was the ozone layer and its potential destruction, only really realized in 1983 by people working with the British Antarctic Survey. And the ozone hole, which formed because of chlorofluorocarbons in the upper atmosphere, was risking disaster if it went worldwide. And essentially, the action was taken so quickly, it was simple because it was one particular chemical doing it, and that was some of the CFCs. But within 4 years, you got the Montreal Convention starting to phase these out. Took 30 years, but the ozone layer is actually healing now. And that would have been a worldwide disaster. I mean, levels of skin cancer would have gone through the roof. And so we have been here before, and it can work. But it's always a case, people already knew about that when they were pushed into action. They could say, look, this is what we know what we've got to do. This proves what we've got to do, and people have listened. And this is why it's sort of so night-age stuff, but I can still say there are reasons for optimism. That's what I would say.
Unfairly, I'm going to couple 2 further questions on climate, which are a bit different. But Roger Hartley, although he's listened to your sort of slightly optimistic view on climate, he wonders how climate change policy can be made to look after those who are going to lose out in the transition. And they're often not the rich people like Trump. Chris Nibbs is wondering which world leader is actually going to lead the path and wave the flag in the opposite direction to Donald Trump and to try to change the rhetoric.
Right. Which world leader? Well, I know at least one leader, but it's of a pretty small country, who is brilliant in this, and that is Maya Mottley of Barbados. And she is extraordinary. And people are already talking about her taking a senior UN position. Barbados is one of a number of Caribbean countries who get the message and are doing the best they can as quickly as they can. And Motley is the best and loudest voice on this at the present time. In terms of world leaders as a whole, I do not see them very much at the level of major states at the moment, and maybe that could change. Maybe we will see, inshallah, God willing, you might actually see, it could happen, you never know, we might even see a Prime Minister in Downing Street who gets it and says we have to do it, and has enough people supporting him, because Britain is so well placed on this. We're so well placed on renewables. You know, the wind power, the wave power, and even the solar, we forget this, that it could happen. I'm sort of going around the circles. I can't give you a direct answer, except as one person at least. There are others who are getting the message. And what is true is that many countries across the global south have woken up to this in a way we don't realize. And wherever possible, they're trying to move things quickly. And one of the best things, of course, is that if you sort of leapfrog the way you move from a non-electricity to an electricity system. For example, you don't go to having a wired telephonic system, you go to maybe mobile phones. And that's happening right across Africa. You don't even need the landline base that you think you need. That is also happening because, broadly speaking, across much of the world, if relatively poor people see there's a way forward that they can afford which make their life better, they will take it up. There isn't this presumed conservatism. Look at all the way in which crops have spread across the world. I worked in Uganda. Bananas came from abroad, tomatoes came from abroad, many crops came from abroad. When they worked, they were taken up very quickly. And in that sense, I think, we have to remember that side of it. But the other issue was the losers. And that's absolutely right, because right across the world, time and time again, the people who suffer are the weakest people, the loser people. And this is one of the things we can at least recognize this and argue very strongly. I mean, my personal view is Britain has really lost it when it comes to international development. I think it's the biggest single disaster for this country, possibly in my lifetime, because we were regarded as a country that it may not have been efficient, it may have been designed to be profitable, but Britain and international development, people saw Britain as one of the few countries which seemed to get it, and we've thrown it away. But that can come back. I would certainly like to see, we peaked at almost 0.7% of GDP. We should be aiming for 1%. I'd love to see a government in power which says we can afford it, and we're going to have to tax the rich a lot more. There's no doubt about that. It's only fair. And, I'm on a reasonable pension, quite a good pension, frankly. I'd pay more, and I think an awful lot of people would. It doesn't have to be from the poorest, not at all. I think we could change the tax system, raise money, put a lot of it into renewables, a lot of it into helping the poorest people in Britain, and also remember the world as a whole, because it's leadership. We don't have somebody who would lead like that. Maybe there's somebody there. I don't see it yet, but you never know, and you've got to live in hope.
Can you see a global contract at state level that's going to balance out in which the winners help the losers?
Any one state, I can't see it at the moment. But again, this is where the more people agitate for this, and I have to say, if that means non-violent direct action, which I think will happen more and more and more, that'll actually make people think a lot more. No, I can't say honestly where it's coming from. All I know is that it's got to come, and it's more likely to come if more people like us want and work towards it.
I'm going to give you some questions that you've generated about migration.
Yeah.
Immigration. But before that, John Mosham's question is asking you about population as a whole. Could you say something about world population change? He mentions the aging North and the youthful Africa and Middle East, and perhaps further afield in Asia. So have you got any broad thoughts where that fits into the argument that you gave us during your talk?
Well, broad thoughts. I think if you look back over 30 years, we still thought, rightly from the evidence 30 years ago, that the world population was going to hit 13 or 14 billion. We now know that it is likely to plateau out somewhere between 10 and 11 billion, much less than expected. And in many parts of the world, you're below replacement, and it's a serious problem. If it wasn't for the fact that we have inward migration, Britain will be in a pretty big mess, as the Scots realize much more than the English, incidentally. You get less of a problem at governmental level in the need for inward migration in Scotland than you do in England. But the reality is that the whole demography of the world is changing, and changing out of expectation. Very blunt about it, who would have thought that a continent which is primarily Roman Catholic, Latin America, is now seeing not a collapse of population, but a huge slowdown in the rate of population growth. And some countries there are almost back to non-replacement. And in other parts of the world, like Japan, like South Korea, like countries in Europe, you're actually getting a decrease in population. In Russia, it's pretty severe. And essentially, that is a change. It's a very big change. Where it is still growing is admittedly, it's across much, but not all of the Middle East, and across most of sub-Saharan Africa. But even there, it is starting to change. So the overall position, we're at about, what is it, 8.2, 8.3 billion at present. I don't remember the precise figures. It looks like by the time we get to 10 or 11, it'll more or less plateaued out, and then we'll start to drop with all the problems there that entails. But it's a very different picture to compare, how I used to do talks on this broad theme 30, 40 years ago. It would be a rather different talk when it came to population, because it would be an account of what people thought would happen then. An awful lot of people, including myself in talking about it, got it wrong. So that is the change. There's still areas of considerable growth. It is sub-Saharan Africa, which is most, but even that is changing now, and changing quite quickly.
Let me give you the flavour of the questions on migration. On the other side of the coin is immigration. So, Pete Gray, is mass migration caused by climate change inevitable? Karen Goodman, where are we with preparing the world for the necessary acceptance of people who will be displaced by climate change? And Maddie Hopley puts it rather differently. How can Western countries cope with immigration that's caused by climate change? Where would you position yourself on these issues?
Well, the problem is we simply don't know what's going to happen in terms of the rate of change. On a worst-case scenario, there would indeed be huge pressure on migration. And essentially, it could get extremely nasty. Let me go back. I think it was trying to get this right. It was 1990, 1991. I think I got the dates right. When you actually had, it was at the end of the centrally planned system. You may remember that Albania more or less came apart at the seams. And it was an incredible state where people were really suffering heavily. And there was a huge amount of anger among the younger population. And on one occasion, I think it was the port city of Durrës in Albania, there was a boat came in, a merchant ship came in, I think it had coming in from Cuba, and something like 10,000 people forced their way onto it and made the crew sail across to Bari in Italy because they wanted a better life. There wasn't any sort of law and order happening in Albania, and of course the Italians were caught completely by surprise. And when the ship got there, the Italians tried to keep it out, but it just sailed in. People jumped overboard or went down sort of hastily erected nets and the rest, and the Italians had to face the best part of 10,000 angry young people in Bari wanting a better life. It was an extraordinary thing, and it was known as militant migration. What do the Italians do? Well, the immediate thing they did is to try to round everybody up. Now, where in an entire city like Bari could you keep 10,000 people? Obviously, it was the football stadium. So they basically turned into a kind of detention center. But to be fair to the Italians, as quickly as they could, they got the people back to Albania and put in the army to help distribute food. And the crisis was eventually overcome. I mentioned that as an example of actual militant migration or angry migration, which was seen. And there's a risk we'll get a lot more of that. And of course, for the likes of the right-wing populists, these are people threatening us. The fact that we're one of the countries responsible for climate change is neither here nor there. So essentially, it's a problem which is likely to develop. You have to make sure people know it's going to develop. And essentially, the only thing we can do about it is to try and be fair to the people coming in, accept that there's a good case to increase the number of younger people in a country like Britain. And saying you send them home, I think, is extremely short-sighted. I'll be blunt about this. It doesn't make life easy, I know. But the reality is that this is what's going to happen, and we have to try and handle it. But what is really important is actually to help the people at the source. And this is why, where you have countries that are in serious trouble, there has to be an emergency aid to ensure that people aren't so desperately that they'll move whatever happens, even if they're risking their lives. And an awful lot of people are risking their lives now, because we tend to forget. When somebody gets as far as Calais, almost certainly that person will have risked their life already en route from Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere else. And I think we also had to remember that it's very easy to say, well, there are all these angry young men. Well, as one should know this by now, what tends to happen, if you have a village or a district in any town, anywhere across the global south, which is in serious trouble, and people want to find a way out of it, they will try and raise enough money for the most able young man to move, and get a job, and send money back to the base. And that is the normal pattern. So many of these young men, often with quite good qualifications, through local Quakers, I'd be able to meet some of them. And essentially, these are people who actually there are exceptions. And there are always exceptions. And by God, the popular press in Britain makes a whale out of this. But they're very few and far between. And in almost every city, there are people often linked to the Methodists or the Quakers, most commonly, who are working around this to actually integrate people in. And time after time, you find very well-educated people. The one person I met who was actually a fully trained dentist in Syria, and all he had to do was really get up to date on his English and then take the necessary tests to get full status as a dentist. We may happen to know we're rather short of dentists in Britain. There are many examples like that. I'm not for a minute saying that it is easy, but I have to say I think many politicians, and not just on the right, use this for their own purposes, basically to build up their own power base. I'll be as blunt as that.
You used a word during your talk, and I'm changing the subject quite a lot now. And this word has prompted some questions. That was the word billionaire.
Yeah.
And there are a few billionaires in this region of the UK, but I don't think any of them are members. It's a very small number. So the questions, therefore, are from non-billionaires.
Okay, right.
So, Sean King, should we find and implement ways of redistributing billionaires' wealth and power? Adrian Cartwright sees it as an economics question. Can you see any solutions to perhaps the related problems of billionaire oligarchs and the ever-increasing national debt? And Paul Forrester O'Neill, he's a bit more, comes on a bit more strongly. Assuming that the rich and powerful will not relinquish control of power, how might it be wrestled from them? Right, so you can choose, you can find a middle way through those sentiments, perhaps.
Yes. Well, I think the one thing one has to say is it's easy to fix on the extremely wealthy people and blame them personally. It's the system which is wrong. The system does not work, and it allows some people who may be at the sort of particular level of behavioral traits, shall we put it that way, who are really likely to make more money. It doesn't have to be. But the system as a whole does not work. And this is why I spent a little bit of time. I'd be very interested if you ask Richard Murphy about how things can change, because then you get all into these modern monetary theory, which is something I've not looked at in any detail. But I suppose in a way, there has to be a change in the system which will affect the wealthiest people more, and should. It's a little bit easy, I suppose, to focus on billionaires. What about the people who are worth 20, 30, 40 million? Farage makes about just under $1 million a year at present on his 10 jobs. He does occasionally go to Clacton, and I gather the local joke is, what's the difference between Farage and God? God is everywhere, Farage isn't everywhere but Clacton. But the point about this is that it is certainly the case that far-right parties seem to have a knack of having extremely wealthy people in and among the leaderships. So you have people who, I won't name the names, but certainly people worth 20, 30, 40 million pounds. The person who actually funds their TV channel, which is GB News, is worth hundreds of millions. And there's one person who gave, I think, a single gift of 10 million to Reform. So you are dealing with considerable wealth, but it's not all billionaires. And I don't know how you do it, but you just have to accept, and people have to accept that this system is going to be disastrous for all of us if we allow it to continue. Yes, you've always had the rich with you, but it is different in the current period, in that you're getting incredible wealth developing. And say there are more than 3,000 billionaires around the world. Britain has, what is it, about 150, just in this country alone. And far more people who are worth 10, 20, 50 million. And that has to change. How? Well, again, there may be wealth tax, I don't know. It may be just fundamentally rethinking the tax system. And I'm not an expert in this, so ask Richard Murphy when he comes. But essentially, it has to change. But it's very easy to say, string up the billionaires. It's not as straightforward as that, and in some ways, we are all responsible for the system that we have to some extent. And as long as we recognize its faults, that at least is a start. So I'm not going to give a straight answer to this is what you do with the billionaires. You've got to change the system so it doesn't work this way in the first place.
You didn't talk about this in your scenario, but Mike Williams wonders, do you think AI will pose a significant threat? And actually, one could say perhaps AI will pose a significant advantage. You might treat it as an optimistic aspect or a pessimistic. Where do you sit on that?
I think you're exactly right. It could be good or bad. And certainly there's a lot to be said if AI can work in a positive way. I suppose I have a problem with all of this, and you look at this from a point of view of even Labour economics. I don't mean Labour political party, work economics. What we tend to find with the kind of system we have, well, let's put it this way. Suppose, just imagine for a moment, you have a particular function or activity which employs 1,000 people and produces so many goods, and people sort of all work at that sort of level. Suppose there's a transformation brought in by a new technology. So that in fact, instead of needing 1,000 people, you only need, say, 600, and you can get rid of 400. Well, you do two things. One is you get rid of the 400, and all the rewards comes to the owners and the shareholders, or else you can say, okay, well, let's everybody go down to a 3-day week on the same wages. And if you do that, you're spreading the wealth of the innovation around everybody. It's a very simple model, but in practice, it's looking at the system where you're actually saying the system itself is in such a way that any major new development actually will tend to benefit relatively fewer people because they can control who is employed. And what I'm saying is essentially, this is what I think can apply to AI and is applied to many of the recent technologies of the last 40, 50 years. It depends on how you run it. It's certainly true that now we could all work a 3-day week if the system worked differently. And in fact have the same kind of wealth as we had, but shared out in a different way. And it's that kind of approach, I think, which you have to consider making. Because if you did do that, then it would work. Apart from anything else, I mean, I know a local accountant firm only employs about 20 people. They went down from a 5 to a 4-day week. And people work a little bit longer hours, so they're not working the full hours they worked before, a fair bit less. But there's no loss of salary. And they're actually more productive. So I think you approach it in different ways, but essentially it's through major new developments which basically reduce the need to employ people, then employ the same number of people less of the time, and basically share the money out fairer. Be a much fairer system.
You generated quite a few other questions about capitalism and neoliberalism. So Martin Drew was wondering whether the economic experiment that you talked about, Thatcher and the others, whether that's run its course. Julie wonders how much of an impact neoliberalism has had on the environment and can we afford it to continue. Graham Daly takes it in a different way. He wonders whether he's asking really about the Chicago model, whether the objective capitalism is to maximize consumption and therefore the planet can't afford it. Apparently the original answer was, well, capitalism is the only system that improves people's lives. So I wonder where you'd position yourself in your optimistic
Right.
view?
I'm probably going to have to ask you to repeat in a moment, but never mind. Probably glasses on will help, wouldn't it? Yeah. Has neoliberalism run its course? All I can say is I hope so. Essentially, yes. Essentially, the idea in neoliberalism is you do increase basically consumption. That can be helpful. And I mean, what is it? Tim Jackson's book, Prosperity Without Growth. It's fairly tough read. And I think he wrote it 12 or 13 years ago. It's a paperback edition, more recent. But basically, Jackson's book on prosperity without growth basically explains how you can have a more prosperous state in terms of the well-being of people, but not necessarily consuming more. And when you think about it, that should not be impossible. And Jackson basically is a prophet Surrey, I think. He actually explains how you can do it. It's a very worthwhile doing. So essentially, I think, how to put it, we've got to come to grips with the fact that I think neoliberalism is bad news when it comes to handling climate breakdown and bad news when it comes to actually improving the state of the environment. And this is one of the reasons why it's got to be transformed in some way. And I think this is going to be brought forward by the fact that neoliberal approaches cannot sort out the climate issue. You can't do it because it doesn't work. It won't work. I mean, you've got to do things now with climate. Well, we put it this way, we should have been doing things in the 20s and the 2010s, which we're now doing. And basically, people are not prepared to see that the neoliberal system, because it is concentrating on short-term gain by and large, essentially is a system which is not suited to meeting the demands of something which is coming up slowly but surely at a slower rate. So to that extent, I think they link in very much. In fact, I should have made that point more clearly in the lecture, that the connection there is very solid. And again, in some ways, I think the neoliberal system, by and large, isn't good on many of the other issues of actually really improving the state of the ordinary biosphere, nature, if you like, protecting nature. One of the reasons that it is still done, that we have an awful lot of people concerned about this, is that fortunately in a country such as Britain, many people do realize the importance of having a wider, more diverse environment for everybody's sake. And so I think that is sort of counteracting what I fear would be natural neoliberal tendencies. It's interesting to know that when you had in the early 1990s, and in fact in the 1980s in particular, where in the Soviet Union were you getting public concern expressing itself even on occasions in demonstrations? It was on environmental issues. I hadn't realized this. I've spent some time in the mid-1980s visiting Moscow and other parts of Russia, and essentially what people were telling me was that in fact one of the big issues is the way in which a very clearly modeled economy which doesn't realize the importance of nature is bad for everybody, and people were beginning to object to it. And it became quite a major feature in ordinary life in Russia, in the Soviet Union at that time. So it's a question really of accepting that in the ordinary way, ordinary people can be ahead of the crowd in terms of what they really believe should be happening. And that, I think, is one way where you can grasp a little bit of optimism out of it.
We've got a number of questions that are trying to bring this discussion down to the level of the citizen. I've got two here. That they are quite different, Paul, if you wouldn't mind addressing them. So, Sebastian Smith, can you give us any realistic action points that we as individuals can implement now? Yeah. And I'll give you Linda Holt's question as well, because it is rather different. Lots of ideas of what could be done in the three areas we've talked about, but she's wondering how we can help us move away from the binary public discourse towards greater coordinated action. Yes. And she doesn't say at what level of society, but would you like to explore that with us, rather than us fretting about billionaires?
Yeah, sure. Fair enough, yes. Yeah. Well, I think that the first thing to say is individual in any area, if you are a concerned individual, then in your own particular area, we will all tend to specialize. I mean, people like me try to look a broad thing, but the things that I concentrate much more on, anybody normally will. And if you're concentrating on an area, well, like saying climate issues, development, human rights, and all the rest, housing, whatever, you will have a particular area in which you are interested and would like to see change. What is important is to inform yourself to the best of your ability. Not that you can sort of shout it down people's throats, but so you have the confidence yourself to be able to say something with sufficient self-confidence for people to listen. Not shout, but listen. So I think we've got to, we are owed it to ourselves to really understand what is happening in the area that concerns us most, whatever that is. And so that's at the individual. But going on to that, then obviously feel, well, good, I'm just one person on one thing. How can I do anything that would make any difference? Well, the point is, you're one person on one thing. There are probably thousands of other people on that one thing, and then maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of people on the different things. Everybody can contribute themselves, and you're part of a much wider issue. And one should never forget that. It's very easy to feel isolated and sort of pushing against the wind. There are always other people around, and there are other people to talk to meet with and compare notes, and basically get more fulfilled. And recognize if you're doing something on one thing, if you're doing something, say, on international development and anything, something with Oxfam, for example, then that is as important as somebody else doing something on a related area, but not a directly related area. Do you see what I'm getting at? And that links to the second one, the need to sort of see things in a more coordinated way. I didn't develop that as much when we were talking about the way those three issues of environment, economy, and security interact. They interact in all sorts of ways. And in fact, Judith Large in particular, who wrote the final chapter of this book, sort of tries to develop that and see how it sort of can all come together. The good news in many ways is there's so much good stuff. Yeah, Carbon Brief is the one I wanted to mention. It slipped my mind before. Carbon Brief is a very good outfit, specialists and generalists who basically publish information on what is happening on the entire climate change carbon area. And Carbon Brief produces a very handy summary every Friday afternoon of what's happening. And you can read it in just a couple of minutes. Just go to Carbon Brief, find out the details, and get yourself on the mailing list, not for all their briefings, because they'll submerge you, but essentially that Friday afternoon, the weekly briefing is brilliant. Carbon Brief, just Google that and do that as a source. And there are similar sources in other areas, and Judith has got a lot of those in that particular book. There are so many areas where good things are happening, where people are already doing this, where one could learn readily, far better than there were, I'd say, 40, 50 years ago.
I'd like to finish, Paul, on a question that we might describe as your specialist subject. And by the way, my apologies to everyone who submitted a brilliant range of questions that Paul stimulated during his talk. But I'm going to finish with Bryn Ebbs's question. And he wonders what, in your opinion, is the single biggest threat to world peace?
I think, as of now, I think I would have to say climate breakdown, actually. I think that's the most immediate one. There is always the risk of a nuclear conflict, and we shouldn't underestimate that. It's actually worse than it was 5 years ago, better than it was 30 years ago, even better than 40 years ago, when there were over 60,000 nuclear weapons ready for use. It is still nonsense. Even now, we probably have the best power. I mean, there are meant to be about 12,000, many of them in store, but there's still thousands that are ready for use even now. But essentially, that actually is better than it was, but it's getting a bit worse than recently. But I think I would have to say climate breakdown is the one that is of greatest concern, I'm afraid. I suppose the rise of the far right is very dangerous, but no, I would have to say climate change, yeah.
There we're going to bring this evening to a close. Many years ago, I worked as a young management consultant in Iran, and I learned some Farsi. I've forgotten nearly all of it, but one or two expressions that just sort of stick in the mind. And one of them is, it's a language of poetry, of course, from centuries before. They have a system, an idea of courtesy, taruf, as they call it. And this one that stuck with me is this expression that I'm allowed to apply to Paul because he's a month older than I am. And you say this with reference to your elders and your betters. Saitum kam nashe, which means, may your shadow never grow shorter. And tonight, Paul, in fact, hasn't cast a shadow. He's thrown a lot of light on some major issues facing the world. And I hope very much that he'll cast that light on this audience in the future for years to come. Thank you so much, Professor Paul Rogers.
Thank you very much.
Take a bow.
Thank you very much.
Please stand up.
Thank you. Thank you.